بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بالضيوف الكرام ونفتتح الجلسة الأولى. أولا في كلمة للأستاذة الدكتورة نورا فالكاو، مديرة المعهد الوقائي لإساءة استعمال المواد المخدرة، وتتفضل الدكتورة في إلقاء كلمتها، وبعد ذلك تفتتح الجلسة الأخرى برئاسة الدكتور جيلبرتو جيرا رئيس فرع الصحة والوقاية من المخدرات. فليتفضل. شكرا.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. And really, let me say that I represent this morning the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime here. Yesterday we have had our executive director. We are very happy to cooperate to this symposium with the government of Saudi Arabia, particularly with the Ministry of Interior. And let me say that we started with the government of Saudi Arabia a real adventure in these last months to cooperate, to be partner in this work in improving prevention and treatment in these countries and in the region, and involving the government of Saudi Arabia in a partnership that will be useful, will be effective in changing the things for also low-income countries in the region. I'm very happy this morning to be here and to give the floor to the first speaker of the morning, that is Dr. Nora Volkov. Dr. Volkov is an exceptional presence for us. He's really the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse in Bethesda, Washington, is doing or financing or supporting or coordinating most of the research in addiction medicine that is done on the face of the earth, particularly in the United States. Dr. Volkov is not only a manager, she's an outstanding scientist. She has a lot of publications. She started particularly to study the brain through the technique of brain imaging. And I have to say that for me, she's really a very important person, because she's a champion of what I consider a growing movement for establishing, for the recognition of drug addiction and addiction in general as disease. Not something moral, not something criminal, not something to be punished, but to be really prevented and treated such as any other disease. And Nora Volkov is really the first of us in promoting this kind of stop discrimination for drug users, treating them equally in the normal health system, and considering them people affected by a problem, by a suffering, and not people to be punished. So thank you, Dr. Volkov. You have the floor.
Gilberto, thanks very much. Good morning. It's basically an honor for me to be here. I want to thank the opportunity to be here in Saudi Arabia. This is my first trip ever. And I thank you for giving me the chance to come to you and discuss some of the findings that relate to the science of substance use disorders and addiction. Tremendous advances have been made over the past 20 years that have led us to recognize that drug addiction is a disease of the brain. It's a chronic disease, which means that the changes in the brain associated with taking drugs are long-lasting and persist years after the person's taking drugs. Many of the breakthroughs that have transformed the way that we look at addiction come from studies that use imaging technologies that allow us to directly look in the human brain and to interrogate what type of changes have happened in a person that takes drugs, just like we have been doing for other medical diseases. And this is elegantly illustrated in the slide that I'm showing you here, that uses a technology for imaging the consumption of sugar by the brain or other tissues. In the lower part, you see the image of a healthy heart, and you see a very high consumption of glucose, because the myocardium, the heart, its main function is to contract itself, for which it requires a massive amount of energy. The heart by the side is the image of a person that suffered a myocardial infarct, who was tested with the same methodology, except that now you see that in this area where you have an arrow, there is a dramatic reduction in the consumption of glucose. And this information is used by the surgeons to determine exactly which area of the myocardium needs to be repaired. The same methodology can now be applied to the human brain, and you can use it exactly to compare a human normal brain for the brain of an addicted person. The images that you are seeing here are horizontal cuts, anterior, posterior, left and right, and illustrated, just as for the heart, is the area of the brain where drug-addicted people have a decrease in consumption of glucose, which reflects that harmful effects of drugs on that particular area of the brain, which is not working properly. What is very telling is that this area of the brain, which is part of the frontal cortex, is crucial for our ability to make judgments and for our ability to exert self-control. So now we understand that one of the reasons why it is so very difficult for people that are addicted to stop taking drugs is because the area of the brain that allows us to exert self-control is not functioning. Out of multiple years of research in animal experiments particularly, we have come to realize why is it that certain drugs, the drugs that produce addiction, why do they do so? We know it is very well understood that all of the drugs, whether it is legal, like tobacco, cigarette smoking, or illegal, like heroin, all of them have a common pharmacological effect in the brain, and that is they increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is the main reward area of our brain. And the reward system evolved over millions of years of evolution to ensure, nature did that, to ensure that an organism will be doing the behaviors that are indispensable for survival of the individual, like eating, or for survival of the species, like reproduction. So these behaviors that are fundamental for survival are linked with the activation of this reward pathway in the nucleus accumbens. And this is mediated by signaling through dopamine, the chemical dopamine. You see here in an animal experiment that measures the increases in dopamine when an animal that has been food deprived is given food. Dopamine goes up, and the magnitude of the increase of dopamine actually predicts how much the animal will work in order to get the food. When you look at the effects of drugs, like for example amphetamine, you can see a much more dramatic increase in dopamine and much longer lasting. And that's exactly what drugs do. They emulate, but they do it in a much more effective way, the activation of the reward system that nature evolved for us to survive. And by doing this, it can actually ultimately disrupt the behaviors of the person to the point that normal behaviors indispensable for survival are given up for the consumption of the drug. The third thing that we now know very clearly is that drug addiction is a developmental disease. And what does that mean? It means that the process of addictions are initiated very early in life, usually in adolescence, and unfortunately, in some instances, in late childhood. So most of the diagnoses of dependence or addictions are going to be made when individuals are in their late teens or their early 20s. And this has to do with two very important factors. The brain of the adolescent, now we know, is actually very different from the brain of the adult. And there are many differences. But one of the most important as it relates to addiction behaviors is the fact that the adolescent brain is not fully connected. It will not fully connect until it reaches late 20s. And among the connections, the last connections to form are those between the frontal cortex and the limbic brain. And the limbic brain contains the areas of the brain that allow us to have emotions, like the amygdala, as well as the reward centers of the brain. So the connection of the frontal cortex with the limbic brain is actually what allows us to exert control, cognitive control, over our emotions and cognitive control over our desires. And this explains why an adolescent or a very young adult is much less able to contain their desires or their emotions than an adult, because the anatomical connection that allows him to do so is not fully formed. The implications of these differences are actually crucial when we think of prevention, because as we look at the problem of drugs in a general sense, the most important intervention that we can do is prevention of drug use. And you have to target children and adolescents. You cannot wait until it is too late, because the age of greater risk is during that those transition years from late childhood into early adulthood. The fourth thing that is clear from scientific findings is that repeated use of drugs will physically change your brain. And it changes in multiple ways. Among others, it damages the function of frontal areas involved with self-control. But it also directly interferes with the function of the dopaminergic system. And as I mentioned, all of the drugs increase dopamine in the reward centers. So dopamine is stimulated, and that activates reward center, and this is perceived as pleasure. But with repeated drug use, these systems start to adapt to the massive increases of dopamine, producing neuroadaptations that actually lead to a downregulation of that dopaminergic pathway. So normally, dopamine is liberated by drugs. It interacts with these molecules called receptors. And what we see is that with repeated drug in addicted people, these receptors start to decrease. So this is the brain of a normal person with a lot of receptors in the central parts of the brain where you have the reward centers, and this is the brain of a cocaine-addicted individual where you can clearly see the decreases in the numbers of dopamine D2 receptors. And it is telling that these reductions in dopamine D2 receptors are not unique to one type of addiction, cocaine. They are also observed in addiction to methamphetamine. They are also observed in addiction to alcohol. They are also observed in addiction to heroin. And they are also observed in addiction to nicotine. And in animal models, animals that actually have low levels of dopamine receptors are much more prone to administer drugs compulsively. And indeed, using experiments in rats, our group has been able to show in animal models where you actually train the animals to self-administer cocaine or alcohol at high quantities, that in these animals, if we do a gene therapy that will allow us to increase these receptors, which we can do in rats but not in humans, then we can profoundly inhibit the behavior of drug taking. And this is illustrated here. This is a study that we did many years ago in rats that were made addicted to alcohol. We injected them with a gene that encodes for the dopamine D2 receptor, and we injected it directly into the nucleus accumbens. This results in an increase in the levels, expression of this receptor at day 4, and as the days progress, it goes back to baseline. But we can inject again, which we do at day 20, and the receptors go up. And when we do that and we observe the behavior, we see a dramatic decrease, in this case, in alcohol taking. This is decreases in alcohol intake. At day 4, when you have the maximal increases, you see a dramatic reduction, 70% lower alcohol consumption. Similar findings are observed after cocaine in a similar animal model. As the receptors go back to baseline, drinking goes back to baseline. We inject again, drinking is reduced dramatically, which is actually extremely interesting because it tells us that one single molecule, a protein in our brain, is able to modulate the propensity for the consumption of high quantities of drugs. One single protein. Now, one of the questions is why is this protein so important in regulating our intakes of drugs? Or when you are low in this receptor, you consume high quantities of drugs. By using imaging studies in which we actually measure the dopamine receptors in the same individuals, but we also measure their consumption of glucose. We can actually ask the question, when dopamine receptors are decreased, what areas of the brain are damaged? And what we've been able to observe systematically, whether it is in cocaine abusers, methamphetamine abusers, or alcoholics, the lower the levels of dopamine receptors, the lower the activity of the frontal cortex, indicating that this protein is modulating our propensity to compulsively consume high quantities of drugs by decreasing, when those proteins are not there signaling, then decreasing the activity of the frontal areas of the brain, which are actually indispensable for our ability to make judgments and to exert control over our desires. Now, we also, apart from the very specific studies on the effects of drugs on the brain that have led us to understand the landscape of changes in the brain of people of addiction, studies are ongoing also to try to understand the multiple factors that contribute to the vulnerability of an individual to become addicted. Because we know, yes, that repeated drug use affects the way that the brain works, which then results in addiction. But we also know that not every person that takes drugs will become addicted. And we know that genes play a very important role in determining who's vulnerable, and genes play a very important role in determining who is resilient, who will have a protection. We also discuss biology, developmental stage. The age at which you start taking drugs is also extremely important. The younger you start to drink alcohol, the younger you start to smoke marijuana, the younger you start to smoke cigarettes, the greater the probability that you will become addicted. And finally, we also know, and we've known this for many, many years, that the environment is crucial in determining, through vulnerability factors or protective factors, whether a person will become addicted or not. We know that family environments that are supportive provide resilience, protection. We know environments that are high in crime and neglect make the individual much more vulnerable to addiction. And what science has enabled us to do, finally, is to actually ask the question and answer it about why is it, what do environments do to our brain that make it either more vulnerable or protected? So now we can directly inquire, what is it? Why is it that the environment is so important? And why is it that the environment, particularly in childhood and adolescence, is so crucial in determining trajectories of substance use disorders as well as mental illness? And this study illustrates